Okay, so we're going to kind of keep talking about the labor market. We'll dive into discrimination today. One thing that has outlined in the syllabus is if you could turn in an early version of your project, I'll kind of go over it and kind of give you some advice on it, even if it's not, the most complete. So the date for kind of that was the end of this week. So I'll create something where you can submit that on Canvas just to make it easy. It doesn't have to be done at this point. It's just if you have something done, you want me to look over it and kind of give a little bit of direction, you can upload it there and I'll get back to you by the end of next week, okay? Other than that, we have that homework assignment due at the end of the week. So I've had a couple people reach out. So make sure that you're kind of doing that as early as possible. I can tell you right now, my Friday is going to be really busy. So if you wait till that last day to have questions, I can't guarantee I'll be able to kind of respond. But if you start, getting questions to me today, tomorrow, Thursday, I'll be able to get you some response. We can set up a time to kind of meet and go over things. Oh, you guys not hear me on Zoom? I guess that's a stupid question to ask. If you can't hear me, you can't hear me, right? So I don't want to do the video. Okay, other people can hear. All right, thank you. Try maybe leaving and coming back in if you can't hear it, okay? Sometimes that, for whatever reason, helps fix the problem. Okay, so where did we leave off? So we were talking about the labor market. And one interesting thing, hold on, my Zoom's kind of acting up a little bit. All right. So one thing that we can kind of take into consideration when we're looking at player wages, and we're looking at kind of the actual data, is that time matters, right? So I'm sure in some of your other courses, specifically financing, you talk about things like net present value. And the idea that $10 million today isn't the same as $10 million next year, because if I would have invested that $10 million today, I'd have, even if I just throw it in like a savings account with, 0.5% interest, I'm going to have more money a year from now. So if you promise to pay me $10 million today versus $10 million next year, I should always take that $10 million today, okay? So you can think about, we can figure out how much exactly that $10 million would be worth a year from now by taking that 10 million and multiplying it by 1 plus whatever the interest rate that it would pay us. Right? So if you give me $10 million today, it's actually worth, 10 million times 1 plus that interest rate. I think I said 0.5%, right? So 0.005. Right? But whatever that investment, you could make that's the interest rate you would plug in here. So that would similarly mean that if I wanted to figure out how much $10 million next year is worth today, I would divide it by 1 plus that interest rate, okay? So, one thing that teams will often do is exploit this fact, or potentially players can exploit this as well. Teams are going to always want to backload contracts, right? So if I'm trying to write a contract to the player as the team, I want to make sure that the years in which they get paid a higher amount are towards the end of that contract, because if I promise to pay you $20 million 10 years down the road, that's worth $20 million divided by 1 plus I, right? It's going to be a lower amount, right? The net present value would be lower. Okay? So teams really want to backload these contracts, right? So when you see like Patrick Mahomes, right? I just signed that like, I might get the numbers wrong, but something ridiculous like 10 years or 450 million or something like that. Well, that contract actually isn't worth $450 million, right? Because even if you divided that equally across every single year, when he's getting paid, $45 million next year, it's actually worth 45 million divided by 1 plus I. It's worth a little less. And then 2 years down the road, divided by 1 plus I to the second power. And then the third year, so you could actually figure out the net present value, and it's not the value that's reported, right? The value that's reported is what it's, how much is overall going to be paid, but it's not its current net present value. Okay? So teams exploit this a lot. Now, what's one type of contract that would allow players to exploit this time value of money? So if I'm a player and I know that if I get $10 million today, it's worth a lot more than if I get $10 million 10 years from now, what's something that might be interesting to me that we did start touching on last class that doesn't count against the cap? Signing bonuses, upfront money, right, that are kind of guaranteed, right? And this is something where it's different reasons, but it does allow the players and the teams to kind of line up. Teams like those signing bonuses because they don't count against the cap, right? They can spend more money on salaries. Players like those guaranteed kind of signing bonuses because I get more of my money now as opposed to 10 years from now, okay? So, we might see that kind of, that's another reason why these signing bonuses are becoming more and more popular, because not only do the teams like them, but the players do as well. I don't think I have an example here. I'm gonna forget who the player was now. Some guy for the Mets. I can't remember who it was, but he did something. Yeah, there you go, Bobby Bonilla. Yes, he signed like a 25-year, $25 million. So he was getting paid $1 million every single year, far past the point where he retired. Right now, yeah, the time value of money made that net present value when he signed it worth less, right? But who knows? Maybe at the time the team wouldn't have been willing to pay him near as much, right? And so he could still get a larger net present value of a contract, but it allows the teams to kind of spread out what they're paying him so that the cap hit was less and less every single year. So there's different combinations of these things that can kind of benefit the player and the team. It doesn't just have to be, it's always best for a player to sign signing bonuses, because if it really helps out the team to spread it out over 25 years, and, even if I look at the net present value of that, it might still be way higher than if they sign me today and kind of had to pay me over the next 3 years, maybe they'd only give me $5 million total, right? So there's, kind of these trade-offs in between whether or not I take the money at the beginning or at the end. And then for the teams, it's usually kind of, they're impacted by that as well, but they're also impacted by the cap hit. In Bitcoin? Yeah. So to be completely honest, I don't know how that works against the cap. My guess is it benefits the team if that cryptocurrency is expected to rise. Because my guess is it's the value of whatever that Bitcoin was when the contract was signed, right? So if I signed a contract 2 years ago and half my salary is in Bitcoin, it was worth, it could have been worth, not very, I don't know, like maybe he only wanted to take, maybe the team would have paid him $5 million and he said, I'll take $1 million in Bitcoin, right? Well, for the team, that's good because it's less of a cap hit. They're giving it to him right away. To the player, right? It's more of an investment. So we get a little bit away from kind of what the benefit is to the team and the player in that scenario, because they're still having to give up $1 million if they give it to him in cash or in Bitcoin. The added bonus there is that player is risky, right? So the team can give him less money, even though his expectation is that he's getting a larger dollar amount, because he's being risky and willing to take this expected value of Bitcoin, and it's all based off projections. So, he's thinking that, his projection of Bitcoin isn't the same as the team's. Well, then he's much more likely to take a bunch of Bitcoin, and the team's, really likely to give him hardly any. Right, but it is my guess is it's the cap hit is whatever the value was when the contract was signed, because they aren't promised. Because as far as I know about that scenario, I don't think that they were paying in Bitcoin over the next 10 years. I think it was more of a signing, like an upfront amount that they were giving it. But I could be wrong, and that probably goes into me needing more legal knowledge about how these contracts are written in terms of if it's not just given in dollar amount. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, right? Because then the time value of money, well, if I get it all today, right, that benefits me as the player. But even if I receive it, if I could somehow write into my contract, I want not $1 million of Bitcoin, but I want five, because the way they value cryptocurrency, it's like one Bitcoin can be worth $1 million. So if I could write into my contract, I want 10 Bitcoins 10 years from now. Well, that helps the team because they can push the cost off. But if Bitcoin goes way, way up, right, I could really value as a player from that type of contract. But it is really being risky because I'm kind of depending on whether or not it goes up or down. So another kind of interesting, just like little paradox that exists in wages is that if we go back far enough, so we go back to Michael Jordan, signed an 8-year, $25 million contract. Kind of, I think this would have been right after, this had been his rookie year? No, a couple years after. So that ended in 1996, right? So, you know, divide how much was he getting paid kind of annually on average, divide 25 million by 8 years. And then the following 2 years, he signed some massive deals, right? One contract worth 30 and the other worth 33. Was he really that much better in 97 and 98 than he was in 96? Probably not, right? But he was kind of locked in this long-term contract. So if you kind of look at his total salary pay, I guess total wages over his career, it's really only about $100 million, right? Which, I mean, if you look at some of the numbers being paid right now, you don't have to be anywhere near the top player in the league to make that much over your lifetime. In fact, Zach Randolph, which I don't know, some of you might not even know who he is. It's long enough ago. And then Rasheed Wallace were two individuals who you look at like how the top wage earners in the NBA over the entire history, they actually made more than Michael Jordan. I don't think anyone's going to argue that the marginal wins that came from their labor was higher than Michael Jordan's. And you probably couldn't even argue that the teams that were on the margin, I think Zach Randolph played, a lot of his years in Portland, which might be one of the smaller markets in the league. So even the marginal revenue per win was probably higher in Chicago than Portland. So how does this work? Why does this happen? Well, you know, you could think about what's one reason why Michael Jordan might be willing not to kind of restructure a contract or might be okay with signing a smaller contract, kind of in terms of how much it was worth, to stay with the Bulls as opposed to go somewhere else. Yeah. So possibly, if he was worried about winning, right, then he might take less money so that the Bulls had more money to spend on the rest of their roster. But let's assume that that's not what's entering into the equation. All he cares about is money. He doesn't care about winning. I think if you've watched The Last Dance or something, that probably seems wild for this specific example, but let's assume that all he cared about was money. What's some potential kind of other benefits that might be from staying with the same team for a long period of time? Yeah, right. If he was to leave Chicago to go to, say, Portland, right? Yeah, his wages from the Bulls are going to be maybe lower than what they could be in Portland. But by staying in Chicago, the endorsement deals that he could get and the value of those to him is going to be a lot higher, right? So you could think about it almost like your supply or your supply curve for labor, right? We say it represents marginal costs. We could actually get, you know, kind of build a more complicated model, and we won't dive too deep into it. I just want to mention it, where those marginal costs are also opportunity costs, right? What am I losing out on by going to Portland as opposed to staying in Chicago? If those costs get high enough, right, the wage that Portland would have to pay me, actually, I'll draw a quick one just to kind of give you an idea. Oh, let's switch the dot cam here. I think this marker might be dying, so hopefully. Okay, so we've kind of kept it a little bit more simplistic, thinking about that supply curve. Anytime I've drawn it, it's like the same for every team, right? A player doesn't kind of care what team he's going to. The marginal cost is the same for the same quantities of labor, right? But what it could look like is something like this. So maybe I have my supply curve for labor. We'll call this in Chicago. Call this the demand curve for labor in Chicago. And actually, let's just assume, to even simplify this further, what if the demand curve, well, actually, no, I won't simplify it. We can try to make this a little bit more realistic. So, you know, the equilibrium wage here might look something like that, right? But what's going to happen is, if he was to go to somewhere like Portland, at every single quantity of labor, the marginal cost is going to be higher because he now has this added opportunity cost of losing out on potentially higher valued endorsement deals in Chicago, right? And so then even if, right, even if we assume that for whatever reason, the marginal revenue per win that he could bring in Portland is higher. I don't even necessarily know if that makes the most sense, but let's just assume that it was. It's a smaller market, so it probably isn't. But if that was the case and the demand curve was in fact higher there, the equilibrium wage that would have to be paid is much, much higher than in Chicago, right? And, you know, if I did these shifts large enough, there's likely a scenario where if the opportunity costs are large enough, this supply curve could shift all the way to the point where maybe I'm up here where there's no intersection, right? There's no wage high enough that they could pay in Portland, right? Or that they'd be willing to pay. That could be enough to compensate for those additional opportunity costs by that player being in Portland. So really the idea is that when you see some of these players that are kind of staying in other markets, potentially it's because that supply curve, right? The opportunity costs or what they'd be losing out on by going to those other cities is so high that there's just not a, you know, there's no team out there that's willing to kind of pay them a wage that would compensate them for those opportunity costs, which is why we might see a lot of teams be able to pay lower wages and keep the players in those cities where there's high endorsement opportunities, right? Probably the best example of this is looking at Chicago is a pretty good example, but New York, LA, right? If I had to guess, I'm guessing LeBron James had some people who were highly advising him when he made his decision to go to LA, thinking about towards the tail end of your career, maybe you want to have these other opportunities. They only exist in this one city as opposed to all the others, right? And so there was probably no team that had the ability to pay him a high enough wage to convince him not to go to the city where all these additional opportunity, right? Money-making opportunities. Any questions on this? And hopefully that's a little clear. Right? Here was kind of the equilibrium wage that would have been paid in Chicago, and right, we could thought about the wage that you would have to pay him in Portland would have to be a lot higher. In fact, the supply curve was shifted enough, there's actually no equilibrium wage that the team would be willing to pay. Ooh, dropped the marker. All right, so just some interesting kind of ideas, you know, thinking about the Jordan brand even. Maybe it would have taken a hit, right? Not being kind of staying in the same city and maybe remaining loyal. Maybe that was part of the brand. And so by going somewhere else, that would have been an additional cost here, but it's the same kind of idea as these additional endorsement opportunities. So let's go to dive into kind of the next topic, which is going to be discrimination that could exist in the labor market. Okay? So we're going to start out with probably the easiest one to think about, which is employer discrimination. Okay? So assume that you've got two types of players. And here, you know, not even kind of boiling this down, we don't have to look at this by race or gender. We could even look at discrimination in lines with something like domestic and foreign players. So this might kind of play a role maybe in the NBA, thinking about, you know, American players versus European. I'm sure the Premier Soccer League, right? You've got a lot of different countries. You could be thinking about domestic versus foreign players. So let's for a second assume they have the same marginal product of labor, or, right, the way we've been writing this is the marginal, you know, the additional number of wins that they're bringing in, right? That's their marginal product of their labor. So we're holding that constant, same quality, what we're saying. So if employers dislike foreign players and, you know, they have some type of discrimination towards them, what we're going to be able to quantify this is a psychic cost. If I had to employ that person, I dislike them so much that I'm going to incur an additional cost to having them on my team. Right? So in the labor market, right, teams are the one who are demanding labor, right? So the demand curve represents the marginal benefit. So if there's this additional cost to employing that foreign player, it's almost like you have the marginal benefit is going to go lower because now you have this additional cost, right? So it's going to bring kind of my net benefits closer to zero. So, put this up here for a second. So another way of thinking about this is higher costs, like these higher psychic costs, my willingness to pay that player is going to go down. Okay? Because you know, he's going to cost me more. I don't like him, so having him around is going to be a hard time. So we can think about this discrimination. What it's going to do is decrease that demand curve for foreign players. Now, I've got ultimately what that's going to lead to, but let's take a look at how we would kind of analyze the labor market in this situation. So let's say I've got quantity of labor and wages. Well, think about the scenario where there's no discrimination. Well, that was kind of easy, but let's assume we've got the same supply curve of labor for foreign and domestic. Right? Under the scenario where there's no discrimination, we had this demand curve for labor, and it didn't matter if you were foreign or domestic, it was the same. Right? So let's just use this as, okay, well, after discrimination, the demand curve for domestic players hasn't changed at all, right? Because they're not being discriminated against. So their equilibrium wage, kind of the quantity of labor that we would see, and actually I should be, sorry, not stars, I can use, probably should use subscripts. So W subscript D and Q subscript D. That's a domestic, equilibrium domestic wage. Okay. Same quality of player, but now, let's say we've got foreign players and there's some additional cost because we discriminate against them. What that's going to do is it's going to lower the demand curve for those foreign players. Now, well, we'll talk about the demand curve shift and I'll mention something else. So we see this decrease in the demand curve that's coming from teams for that group of players that are being discriminated against. So the equilibrium wage there would be equilibrium wage for foreign players. And you can imagine, like, here's the equilibrium quantity for foreign players as well. So we see that the equilibrium quantity of foreign players will be lower than domestic, so teams will be less likely to kind of hire or employ these foreign players, and the equilibrium wage for those foreign players is going to be lower due to this discrimination. Now, you could go into, you know, if these foreign players are going to be discriminated against, what might also occur in this market? So the players aren't discriminatory, but if they end up on a team that discriminates against them, maybe they incur a higher cost to putting up with it, right? I mean, to putting up with someone who's you know, discriminatory. Maybe we see a supply curve shift as well. But simply from the employer discrimination, all that occurs is a demand decrease for that group of players they're discriminating against. If you're then told some additional information, which is that the employees, you know, incur this additional cost once they're on the team because they're not treated as well, et cetera, maybe we see a supply curve shift there as well. Most of the examples I'm going to kind of work through, though, we're going to kind of stop it there. We're not going to assume that there's any type of additional cost incurred once those players who are being discriminated against are on the team, just to kind of simplify. So the only thing that, excuse me, the only negative impact that we're going to be looking at is thinking about how that discrimination is going to force wages for those players to be low, okay? By shifting the demand curve for that type of player to go down. Now, this only occurs if every team in the league is discriminating, right? Because if there's one team that's not discriminating, well, then the foreign players, right? If the team wasn't discriminating, our demand curve would just be back to the demand curve for domestic players, right? Because we said they're of equal quality. So you can almost think about it as there's no additional cost. We're just going to be going based off that same demand curve for both foreign and domestic players, right? So if we can find one team out there who's not discriminatory, they're going to pay higher wages. They're always going to be able to attract those higher quality foreign players to go away from the discriminating teams and come to theirs. So if you are discriminating and someone else isn't, it's more likely they end up with some higher quality players because they're always going to be willing to pay them a higher wage. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? All right. So lower wages and lower number of players hired was kind of the result of that discrimination. So, you know, we end up with kind of lower wages for foreign players and fewer players from whatever group was being discriminated against. So what if we had free agency? Okay. So let's assume every single team in the league is discriminatory, right? So that every single team, when it comes to foreign players, they had this discriminatory cost or this additional psychic cost that they were bearing if they ever employed one, right? So every team's discriminating, right? Well, what happens if we go from, let's say we had 30 teams all discriminating to just one team who wasn't discriminatory? Well, that team, right, would be willing to pay that player the true value that they brought to the team. Right? Because if they're not discriminatory, their demand curve is actually back here. Right? It'd be no different for a domestic and a foreign player. Oh, sorry, right here. So they'd be willing to pay them up to this wage, right? How much value the additional wins that player was bringing in would bring to the translate to revenue for that team. Okay? The issue is if I'm the only non-discriminatory team, what do I know about the wages that other teams are willing to pay that player? Well, I know every other team in the league is only going to be willing to pay him this wage. So instead of paying him a wage as high as what I'm, willing to, the maximum point I'm willing to go up to, maybe I give him an offer right here. It's still better than every other team in the league, but I don't have to pay him quite as high of a wage, him or her, I guess. All right, so really any wage in this range will be a wage that the non-discriminatory team could offer that will be greater than any other offer that they'll get, right? So they're always going to be kind of going with that non-discriminatory team, but that wage wouldn't be as high as what that team would be willing to pay, right? Like they would still go higher if there was one other team that was competing against them. But the problem is every other team that is competing against them has this discriminatory cost, right? So nobody has the same kind of cost structure you could think of as that one non-discriminatory team. Now, what happens if there's just two non-discriminating teams? Well, now if that first team offers the player wage here, the second one says, well, they're still worth a lot more, so we'd actually be willing to pay them a little bit more. The other team says, well, we would still get him for this wage, and it's less than the amount of additional revenue he'll bring in. And basically those two teams would you could go back and forth until they basically would get to that point where the player would be being paid a wage of exactly the amount of additional revenue per win that they're bringing in. So as long as we have two non-discriminatory teams, we end up with a scenario where they kind of are competing with each other, and we get back to wages being equal to the value of that player's marginal product or the marginal number of additional wins they're bringing in. Now here I said, what happens if half, like I said, you really only need two. So if half, if you only need two, if half the league is non-discriminatory, then you're going to get those wages back up to what they should be, okay? Which is kind of this equilibrium point. Does that make sense? Are there any questions on that? I didn't realize I just had it picture in picture there, so if you couldn't quite see something, feel free to ask me as I was working through that. Okay. All right, so ultimately the story there is employer discrimination doesn't really matter as long as we can get there to be enough teams to compete with each other who are non-discriminatory. Right? Even if half the teams are discriminatory, foreign players will be okay. They'll just end up on those teams that aren't discriminatory, right? So we might see some natural kind of segregation there based off of those employers' discrimination tastes, I guess we could call them. But if every team is discriminating, it's going to force wages to be low. And even if only one team is non-discriminating, we said, yeah, wages will be just slightly higher, right? Because I know I don't have to really offer the amount of money I'd be willing to pay because I can get away with offering a lower wage and still be the best offer that player will get. All right. Another, excuse me, way to think about this is, how do I want to hit this bullet point? So we'll draw another graph and try to explain discrimination a little bit differently as well. So we've got quantity of labor, got wages, supply curve for labor, got the demand curve. So let's say we've got our domestic players here, demand for the foreign players down here, which you can kind of think about because we said assume that quality is constant. It was really just the demand kind of minus this discrimination cost, right? That was what was bringing down that demand curve. So if I think about the wage, right, that the discriminatory team was willing to pay this foreign player, well, they're going to be paying this player, you know, a much lower wage. Then we think about at that quantity of labor, what is the actual kind of revenue that that player would bring in? Well, the player would have brought in, right, at that quantity of labor, a much, much higher additional amount of revenue per win. So if this player, you know, decides to kind of go with me, if everyone's discriminating, I'm going to end up paying less. Sorry, think about it this way. For each additional dollar of revenue I bring in, I'm paying a much lower wage kind of per dollar brought in. Right? Whereas if I think about if they're non-discriminating, and we end up at this equilibrium, right, because there's no additional discrimination cost, well, now the wage I pay is exactly equal to the marginal revenue per win, additional win that player is bringing in, right? Because the point is the same on the supply and the demand curve. So if everybody's discriminating, right, teams are kind of getting away with paying less per kind of unit of talent from those discriminating teams, right? So this is bad for players, right? They're getting paid far less than the value they're bringing into the team if there's discrimination that occurs. No discrimination occurring, they're getting paid exactly what they're worth, okay? So if we then end up with one team I shouldn't say one, multiple teams who are non-discriminating, well, they're going to end up paying those higher wages. They're going to be able to attract kind of higher quality players. And, you know, because they're willing to pay exactly what that player is going to bring in, whereas the discriminating teams were going to be paying them under what their value was. So the foreign players are always going to be choosing kind of the teams that are non-discriminatory, which means higher quality players who are foreign are always going to choose those non-discriminating teams, which means that really the discrimination, right, if I want to be discriminatory, it's just going to lead me to being a lower quality team, right? Which, you know, hopefully drives those teams out of the league, or at least eliminates those discriminatory practices. Okay? You know, it's not a nice argument, but right, maybe someone could still be discriminatory, but it's just that those additional discriminatory costs become outweighed by what they're losing out on, right? So they're losing out on these higher quality players. So maybe in their heart of hearts, they're still very discriminatory towards that group. However, they kind of, those psychic costs start to get closer and closer to zero because my team quality is so much lower. It now, you know, I'm okay with having those players on my team as long as I can kind of win additional games. But we didn't really fix the problem of discrimination. We just fixed the problem that at least that discrimination isn't impacting that group's wages. So do wages kind of tell the whole story here? So maybe not. So this is where it starts getting nuanced. So now we understand how discrimination would impact players if quality was held constant. Well, we can start to think about in the real world, in the data we see, that's not necessarily always the case, right? So let's assume that foreign players are more productive than domestic players. Would their wage still be lower with discrimination? So we've now got this situation where foreign players are being discriminated against, but they are more productive than domestic players. Said differently, they have a higher marginal, or, you know, add a higher number of additional wins, or their marginal wins per kind of unit of labor is higher. So we've got the marginal wins that are coming from labor for a foreign player on average is greater than that of domestic players. Well, we know that the demand curve for labor is equal to the marginal revenue per win times the marginal wins that come from that labor, the number of additional wins they add. So here what this is going to tell us is we're thinking about the labor market. Let's assume that the marginal kind of revenue per win is, we're looking at kind of the same team. So that marginal revenue per win is going to be the same, right? So this is kind of no different between foreign and domestic players, right? There's no like, I guess here we're kind of assuming away that maybe foreign domestic players would speak to different consumer bases. We'll kind of touch on that here. I think it's either the next topic or the one after that I have. But what we're really thinking about is that demand curve is going to be different because these players have different marginal wins that they're bringing in, or they have different kind of this captured quality. Right? So we could think about the demand curve for domestic players is going to be less than the demand curve for foreign players. That's going to kind of drive this difference. Right? Let's assume for a second, well, not for a second, we're going to assume for this example, that the supply curve for labor is no different between domestic and foreign players. Okay? It kind of helps us really get at this idea of quality differences and discrimination. So if this was my scenario without discrimination, I could determine that kind of the wage that would be paid to domestic players would be lower than that paid to foreign players. And that makes sense. They're of higher quality, right? So they should end up kind of being paid because their higher number of additional wins is going to bring in more money, so the team should be willing to pay them up to that amount. So what if we introduce discrimination now against foreign players into this model? And let's assume that it's not a wild amount of discrimination, that it's a relatively low psychic cost to these discriminatory employers. That's going to decrease my demand curve. So we can think about now the demand curve for foreign players, and we'll call it just DIS, kind of plus this discrimination cost. Right? And you could, just write in C here, like think about there is some cost, but just to reference, this is the cost coming from this, discrimination of these employers. Well, now the equilibrium wage for foreign players with discrimination is going to be a little bit lower, right? However, when we look at the data, it's going to look like, oh, of course there's no discrimination going on. On average, the foreign players are being paid more than domestic players. Well, yeah, but that gap should have been even wider, right? Without discrimination, that gap in wages should be wider if those players are getting paid exactly what their value is to the team. Okay? So when we have kind of, any type of productivity differences, we've got to be really careful, because just because we see that the wage is higher for the one group, it doesn't mean that domestic players are being discriminated against, right? We've had a quality difference that's really kind of driving that gap. But also, that gap maybe should be even wider, right? Because we can't really observe what that discrimination cost is. It's really hard for us to observe that. All we can really observe in the data is wages, okay? So we have to be careful that, just because that the wage of foreign players here is higher than domestic players, there still could exist discrimination in that labor market, okay? Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we kind of just walked through that. We could see that their wages don't necessarily have to be lower. They could still be higher, and we could still have discrimination existing. So kind of using some of these concepts and ideas, we can kind of walk back through history and think about maybe some kind of, actually, is this the history one? Yeah, the segregation that existed, right? So prior to the integration of MLB, black players kind of had their own league, right? So at the time, I mentioned we're going back in time, right? This was referenced to as the Negro League, right? and they had their own teams. They played in all these different cities, and they really were a competitor with Major League Baseball, right? Because at the time, the discriminatory cost, right? These people were so discriminating so high, such a large degree that it was driving the demand curve down, right? You can imagine if my discrimination cost was great enough, if my demand curve is down here, what's the equilibrium number of players I have coming from that group I'm discriminating against? Well, those two never intersect. I basically just never hire anybody from that group that I'm discriminating against, which is what we had back in the day, right? There wasn't a single team that had a black player, despite the overwhelming evidence from their own league that they were likely high enough quality to be in Major League Baseball. Okay, so demand was really high for baseball at the time. So we had high marginal revenue per win. A lot of the players in kind of the competing Negro League were high quality. So why weren't they in Major League Baseball with higher wages? What was that? It was that huge discrimination cost, right? Driving the demand curve so far down, they didn't even employ one single black player, okay? So once the integration began, right, we kind of had kind of a good thing, kind of a bad thing occur. So what started to happen was, well, now the demand curve, as soon as the MLB starts introducing black players onto their teams, the demand for the Negro League declined, right? Because now I can see the highest quality players who kind of transitioned over, they're now in Major League Baseball, right? So it really dropped the value of the players and wages of players who remained kind of not in Major League Baseball and kind of in the Negro League still, right? So for a lot of those players, it really hurt them, right? Before there was an opportunity for them to earn higher wages, well, now when the MLB is kind of taking players from their league, or taking players into their league, it's going to decrease the demand curve overall from this competing league. Now, what players would be the first players that first black players that Major League Baseball would add? Well, we can go back and think about it. Instead of foreign domestic here, we could put this as kind of white and black players. So kind of our you can think about if the demand curve was way down here, even with discrimination, well, what would be kind of the first players that we would add? What would be higher quality players, right? If the player quality got high enough that they bring in a high enough additional number of wins, right? Well, then even with a huge discrimination cost, eventually we're going to get to the demand curve where we start employing, or we start kind of hiring some black players into our league. And they're going to be the highest quality, because that higher quality is going to basically outweigh the discrimination cost, right? Even though that discrimination was really, really large, their quality was so great that it overcame that discrimination, okay? So MLB gets the highest quality players, right? And this really, really hurts the other league, who, really was the only other opportunity for black players to play baseball at the time. A lot of them, kind of low quality players, they're still facing this demand curve down here. They're not able to kind of get into Major League Baseball, even though their quality might be higher than the white players in that league at the time. So, once we saw this integration occur, it took the highest quality players from the Negro League and put them into Major League Baseball, but it hurt the demand curve for the Negro League, which marginal revenue per win starts to go down for them. Players get lower wages there. So eventually this kind of forces it out of existence, right? And then we've got a problem, right? So even though we're integrated now, as long as that discrimination occurs, the players who ended up in Major League Baseball are still going to be paid wages vastly below what they should be earning, right? So although integration was good, right, it gave the opportunity to these players to play in Major League Baseball, potentially, right? So it was better for them, but it still wasn't as good as what it should be, right? Because the discrimination was still occurring in Major League Baseball, right? When we think about if they're now in Major League Baseball and getting these lower wages, well, that's, they're in the major leagues. Maybe the wages are higher than what they were in the Negro League because even with discrimination, that marginal revenue per win was so much higher for Major League Baseball that maybe their wages are higher than what they previously were, but they should be way up here, right? They should be way up here in that demand curve. So what kind of helped force that integration? We kind of already mentioned this, but really the value of the best players just started to get so large, right? The quality of those players was so high that it just overcompensated these discrimination, kind of the taste for discrimination, right? How, the psychic cost that these teams had. And you maybe could argue that over time that kind of discriminatory cost was declining, right? People were becoming less discriminatory, but the large part is really those higher quality players. They're going to bring in so much additional revenue that teams just, their kind of additional psychic cost from their discrimination taste wasn't large enough to overcome the increase in revenue they can make from having these high quality players, right? Also, we haven't really looked at this yet, but we could have had supply differences in kind of foreign, domestic, or here black and kind of white players. And what ended up starting to happen was the supply of low-wage white players just started to decline. And so if I wanted to kind of get a player of equal quality, pay a player a similar wage, there just weren't any of kind of an adequate quality around. Once the competition started to decrease, right, another kind of benefit that this added, right, so not just employing these higher quality players was good for Major League Baseball, but if I'm taking my competing league's best players, and if I can eventually drive them out and then become a monopoly again and have monopoly power, not only do I have monopoly power in the product market, which increases the marginal revenue per win, I also get monopsony power in the labor market. So now I don't have to just pay black players lower wages. I'm actually kind of decreasing the wages I'm paying everyone because I now have this monopsony power. And right, this was way before the players union, and we still had kind of the reserve clause here. And so kind of by taking the competing league's highest quality players, I drove them out, right? Which then gave me back my monopoly and monopsony power. So there was, it's nice to think that integration happened because people's hearts changed. It's probably a more of a kind of byproduct of, if I'm just thinking about this from a profit maximizing standpoint, it made perfect sense for the Major League Baseball to go out and get those high quality players, right? Drive competing league out of the market. And now I've got my monopsony power back. I know that I probably won't see another competing league because I now have allowed integration. And kind of I can lower my wages, that I'm paying players, so lower my costs. I've also increased the demand for my sport because I've driven out the competing leagues, so I can increase my revenues. Increasing revenues, lowering costs, increasing profits. Right? And maybe I'm being too cynical here, and maybe integration was driven in part by the kind of reduction in that discrimination cost. But all the kind of signs economically would point to a large part of it was being driven by these economic incentives, right? Okay, so could employer discrimination be justified, right? So could it be justified? So let's say if one group has higher productivity than the other group. Well, before discrimination, when I had drawn this out earlier, if you ignore these red lines, we said, well, yeah, I mean, it's not that they're being discriminatory, but if we look at the wages, kind of think about this like a gender pay gap, there's a wage gap between foreign and domestic players here, but it's not being driven by discrimination. It's just being driven by productivity differences. Okay? So potentially we see difference in wages that's driven by productivity. And one thing that a lot of teams will do is, and we're talking about kind of the wages here, we're talking about averages. And we're also talking about when I say foreign players on average have a higher productivity than domestic players, then we're thinking about the average, right? And we should see higher wages for foreign players compared to domestic. But for any one player, right, there's a distribution to quality. So for any one player, they may not be of any one foreign player, they may not have higher productivity than any one domestic player. It's just on average they are. So what a lot of teams might do, and this could be based off of not just race, when we think of discrimination, it's not just based on race, but maybe they use statistical discrimination to judge or to kind of predict what that player's productivity would be. Right? This would probably be most applicable when we're thinking about rookies, right? Because we don't have a measure of what their productivity is yet. Okay? So, I'll use an example that's not race, and then I'll kind of probably work into one that is, because those are very applicable examples. We do see racial discrimination going on. One might be, the one that I always hear is height discrimination when it comes to NFL quarterbacks. So this has kind of went away in more recent years, but like when I was a kid, when you were looking at the players draft, I mean, if you had a quarterback under 6 foot, the league didn't want to look at them because on average, historically, they had a lower productivity, right? So I wasn't willing to pay a quarterback under 6 foot near as much money as one who was 6'5", right? Because I thought that height told me something about their productivity. What we've now kind of come to realize is, well, there's actually, several players who can be productive at various different height levels. That height is not really a good predictor. But at one time, that height was used to discriminate against players, and it wasn't out of malice. It's not like they hated short people, but they thought that was a good predictor of kind of productivity. Right? So if individual information is hard to get, we might see employers start to rely on these kind of averages, these group statistics, right? But for any one player, right, height might not be a good indicator of their productivity at all. So is it justified? I mean, probably not. I mean, if we're doing our signing our contracts on a individual level, probably want to try to find kind of better measures of productivity as opposed to kind of just these kind of metrics of height or race or something like that, right? And one thing that, this can cause is if I start to behave based off this statistical discrimination. So let's say, we use the height example. So anyone under 6 foot, I think their productivity is going to be so low that I don't want to give them a high wage or I don't employ them. Well, then what ends up happening? Well, then there's no quarterbacks in the league that are over 6 foot. And now it looks like, yeah, well, if you're not over 6 foot, you can't have success in the NFL. Well, no, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. I believe that group, that shorter group, was not going to have success. So guess what? They weren't given opportunities, and they end up looking like they have less success in the NFL. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy a lot of the times when we're making decisions based off of statistical discrimination. Okay? All right, first of all, any questions on that before we kind of continue on here? In this statistical discrimination, I would think, NFL is a great example where we might see this play out. Excuse me. A lot of teams kind of fall victim to this self-fulfilling prophecy where a lot of teams may look at historical productivity at different positions and might say, well, historically, we see this position has a higher percent of white players, and this one has a higher percentage of kind of black players. Well, if you make your decisions based off that, you're never going to give other players, the opposite race opportunities at that position, right? And then it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? For a long time, this was white quarterbacks, right? The league believed, and they probably wouldn't agree with this, but if you look at the hiring practices and kind of, this self-fulfilling prophecy where they didn't think that, a non-white player could really play quarterback. Well, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy because no non-white players were given opportunities to play quarterback. In fact, a lot of kind of black quarterbacks in college were forced to play other positions, right? They switch them over to, wide receiver, running back. So is it justified? Not really. You could argue it's justified in that they just don't have the information, so they're just using a proxy, but not really, right? It's going to end up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so employee discrimination is going to be a little bit different than employer. So what we just went through was if the teams are discriminatory. Okay. What if we have employee discrimination? Right? So if employees discriminate against employers, right, this is going to be kind of similar to what I was talking about, where if I know a team is going to be discriminatory towards me, I don't want to be on that team, right? There's an additional cost to me as a player being on a team where the owner hates people of my race, right? Or my gender or whatever it is. Okay? So with employee discrimination, you feel like you're being paid a lower wage. Whatever wage they're giving you, that's really not the value to you to be on a team. And we're starting to kind of try to translate wages here a little bit more towards utility, because even if I'm being paid 30 million, it doesn't feel like that because there's such a loss in utility from all the discriminatory kind of, whatever it is, being, maybe someone, using, negative language towards them, just being treated kind of worse. That's going to make my utility kind of drop, or think about the wage will feel like kind of I'm getting less utility from that same wage. That's probably the best way to think about it, actually. Less utility from being paid the same wage when I'm being discriminated against. Well, it could also work that maybe I just incur this additional cost, right? Because I don't like to maybe play for, I don't know. You could think about maybe there's a team who has a white coach or a black coach, and white players don't want to play for the black coach. So there's employee discrimination going on towards that team. So we'll kind of use this value of D. This represents kind of the taste for discrimination, right? So how much this employee kind of really is being impacted by playing for this team that they discriminate against. So what that's going to do, like 1 minus, and D is going to be somewhere between 0 and 1, so that the wage that they're being paid feels less than it was, without discrimination. So if there's no discrimination, this is 0, and whatever I'm being paid feels like what I'm being paid. If I have any type of discrimination towards that team because of, whatever, the race of their coach, or maybe I don't like the city that they play in because there's a higher proportion of a certain race, so this starts to get higher and higher, kind of approaches 1. So what this is going to do is really kind of create a difference in the supply curves of labor, right? I'm going to be less likely to supply my labor to a team that I am discriminatory towards, whether or not it's because of their coach or the city they play in. And we could probably kind of think about, other aspects, like maybe just the other players on that team, or of the race or the gender that I'm discriminating against. So lower supply to those teams that we're discriminating against, right? So what's going to happen to wages? All right, so we can walk through this example where we have employee discrimination. So we've got this quantity of labor, wages, the demand curve for labor. Now let's assume that there's no discrimination coming from the employers, or no discrimination coming from the team. So this is the demand curve. It perfectly reflects the value of the marginal number of additional, or value of the marginal wins from labor, or marginal revenue per win times that player's number of additional wins they bring in, or the marginal wins that are coming from that labor. So we're going to have this supply curve, right, for labor, and this is going to be on teams that the player does not discriminate against, right? So they kind of, you can think about, we'd end up with, what are we going to call this? We'll call this the quantity, equilibrium quantity from teams we don't discriminate against, and the wage from teams we don't discriminate against. However, if there are teams out there that we, don't want to play with players of a certain race, coaches of a certain race, what that's going to do is it's going to kind of make my wages the same wage, right? So if I'm getting paid the same wage here, it's going to feel like I'm being paid less, right? Or another way to think about it is, to supply the same amount of labor, I'm going to require a higher wage, right? Because if you pay me this wage, it's not going to feel like it's near as much because of this additional kind of that DJ, that discriminatory taste component. So we get this reduction in the supply curve such that in order to, the equilibrium wage I would have to be paid to play on a team that I'm discriminating against would have to be higher, right? The only way that this team can convince me to play for them is if they give me a wage that's so high that it overcomes that taste for discrimination. Right? And what it's going to lead to is on those teams that I discriminate against, I'm going to see a lower quantity of these discriminatory, these discriminating employees, right? And that kind of makes sense, right? If these players, let's say that, the scenario is I've got a team completely composed of black players. I have a white player going back, to the Major League Baseball example. And a white player looks at it and says, well, look, I don't want to play with black players. So I have this huge discriminatory taste. My supply curve shifts back for that team that has all black players. So if they want me to be on that team, they're going to have to pay me a higher wage than a team that otherwise would have kind of maybe all white players. And we're going to see fewer of these discriminating white players end up on those teams that have kind of the all black players. So if you want to think about this, like the teams that are being discriminated against, maybe you think about that as a completely black roster, non-discriminating teams, maybe completely white roster, or we could go back to domestic and foreign examples as well. So a result that you would have to pay them a higher wage, right, for them to end up on that team. And so ultimately the number of discriminatory employees that end up on those teams with whatever race or kind of type of people are being discriminated against is going to be lower than on those teams where they wouldn't be discriminating. So it ultimately has the same effects as employer discrimination, right? Okay. Sorry. Let's go back. Sorry, I said the same. It's not going to be the same. It's the same in that we see fewer of those types of players on that team. However, if they do end up on that team, they'll end up with higher wages. Okay. What we could also see is, and we'll try to point this out in the same graph. So if instead of thinking about, well, I'll draw a different graph. Instead of thinking about so much like the overall kind of labor market, and we just think about maybe for like one individual player. So for one individual player, all right, we're going to have the demand curve for that player, whatever their quality is. And I could think about, I've got their supply to that team that they don't discriminate against, and their supply to the team where they're discriminating against them for, whatever, the racial makeup of their roster, okay? Well, let's say we think about maybe this quality, these units of labor. If we want to think about it, it's going to be some number of games. So let me think where to put this to make the most sense. So if I wanted to do, so let's think about here, right? To get this same quantity of labor, I know that the wage that a discriminatory, like that a player would have to receive to be on that team that they discriminate against would be somewhere up here. To get that same units of labor, if I'm a team that, say, doesn't have any of the members that person's discriminating against, so maybe it's like here for a white player, if they're discriminatory towards a roster with all black players, they would have to be paid this wage to play on that team. But if it was on a team that had all white players, they would take a much kind of lower wage, right? Well, if I'm the only team in the league that has only white players, like let's say it doesn't have to be an all black roster, it was just one black player, like going back to kind of the integration of Major League Baseball. If I'm the last team holding out, I'm the last team that has an all white roster, well then when it comes to employee discrimination, right? White players who are discriminatory towards any team with black players is going to look at this and say, well, look, in order to kind of supply the same quantity of labor, I need this wage to be on a discriminatory team, but a much lower wage to be on those teams that I'm not discriminatory towards. So those teams can get away with paying lower wages, right? And those wages will be quite a bit below kind of what that player's value is, right? If we see kind of the difference between the demand curve and the wages here, it's going to be much, much kind of lower, right? The wage they're paid is much lower than the value they'd be bringing into that team. Okay? Now, as soon as we have kind of, integration across all of them, well, now there's no kind of option, right? There's no outside option here for, there's no team with an all-white roster. Well, now, if your taste for discrimination is enough, what's going to happen? Well, if your taste for discrimination is enough, once these teams go away, there's no more all-white rosters. You're kind of facing this scenario where in order to be here, you're going to have to be paid a higher wage in order to play for those teams. But what if we had a demand curve that was like somewhere down here? Well, then once those all-white rosters are gone, there's no intersection here. We might end up with some of those players actually not being employed by any team in the league, right? So, excuse me. That's kind of, I don't know. It's a lot going on there, but kind of using that to describe some of these principles. Okay, so we've got employer discrimination, or employee, sorry, I misspoke. A really good example of this, it was in 1947 when Jackie Robinson became the first player in Major League Baseball, so integration occurred. The Dodgers traded away 5 players for 1 mediocre player, right, who was willing to play with Jackie Robinson, right? So we had 5 discriminatory employees. What does that mean? Well, if I add Jackie Robinson to my team and those employees are discriminatory, they would now want higher wages to play for me, right? So what the Dodgers said was, look, we're not willing to pay you higher wages just because you don't like to play with, with Jackie Robinson. So we'll just trade you and get a non-discriminatory employee who's going to be willing to take, the wage that's exactly equal to their value, the marginal product of labor. So the manager was kind of quoted as saying the following, which was what? I always love this quote. So I hear some of you don't want to play with Robinson. Some of you have drawn a petition. Well, you know what you can do with a petition. I hear Dixie Walker is writing a letter to be traded, which was a player at the time. Well, hand him the letter. You're gone. I don't care if a fellow is yellow, black, or has stripes like a fucking zebra. I'm the manager, and if I say he plays, he plays. I'll play an elephant if he can do the job. So basically what this guy's getting at is he didn't care. All he cared about was kind of bringing on the highest quality player that he could, right? There was no taste for discrimination. So if your employees had the discrimination cost, I'm not going to pay you higher wages. I'm just going to replace you. I'm going to replace you with an employee who's non-discriminatory, right? So as long as you're going to have the employer being non-discriminatory, as long as supply is high enough, you can drive out these discriminating employees simply based on you can just replace your discriminatory employees, right? Now, if we have both employer and employee discrimination, things start to get a little bit interesting. We'll dive into that a little bit more next class. Okay? But with employee discrimination, if we do have employee discrimination, but employers aren't, does it matter, right? Basically what I just said, no, right? Because the employers are not going to pay those higher wages just because you don't like to play with someone who doesn't look like you, right? And so they're not going to pay those higher wages. And as long as there's enough supply out there, they'll just get someone of equal quality. They can pay a wage that's exactly equal to the value of their marginal product of labor. Right? So, teams aren't going to pay these higher wages. So the group who doesn't discriminate takes that lower equilibrium wage, and we end up with a league that then begins to be populated by only non-discriminating employees. Okay? So all things equal, equality was equal. Teams will always kind of pay that non-discriminating employee more. Won't pay them more. They will always end up with that non-discriminating employee because they don't have to pay them more. Okay? What's another alternative employees could do? Well, they could just keep their team like back instead of hiring Jackie Robinson. They could have just said, well, what's another way I don't have to pay these 5 players higher wages? I just wouldn't kind of put Jackie Robinson on my team and kind of still have an all-white roster. So that's really, if they decided to go that route, that's what created these segregated leagues to begin with, right? Was this attitude of, well, what's another way I can keep wages where they are, just not bring on this one player that these 5 players my employers are being discriminatory towards. So it's not always great, right? If there's a high enough supply out there and the quality of this discriminated group is high enough, then we will see integration occur. But potentially, if there's employee discrimination, it could on itself, without employer discrimination, employee discrimination could cause the leagues to be segregated as well. Luckily enough, kind of like over time, this ended up not being the case. The quality of the quality of the best players in the league, like Jackie Robinson, was so high that I'm not okay with keeping my team an all-white roster just so that I can appease these discriminating employees. All right, I think that should bring us, so that'll bring us to consumer discrimination next class. So we'll relate the consumer discrimination to what we talked about today. We'll dive into a few more examples. We'll look at things like gender differences. Think about not just how discrimination is going to impact these labor markets, but the combination of discrimination, different revenues across leagues, different quality players. I'll just kind of keep continuing on this topic. Any questions for me before we're out of here today? So I will put up an online quiz that'll be due before we meet on Thursday for class. So I'll get that up as soon as I get back to my office. Other than that, enjoy the weather, and I will see you guys on Thursday.